All right. Welcome, everyone. Hi, I'm David Marquis. I'm the country manager for Intuit Canada. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the federal election town hall on small business priorities. All of us at Intuit QuickBooks are proud to partner with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business on this really important event. Intuit is a mission-driven global financial platform company that gives everyone the ability and the opportunity to prosper. We are dedicated to empowering people around the world to improve their finances and live the lives they want. QuickBooks is the world's largest platform for small businesses and is dedicated to powering prosperity for millions of small businesses globally. Small businesses like yours are the backbone of the Canadian economy. This virtual town hall will provide an opportunity for small businesses to ask our political leaders about the issues on your mind as our country moves towards economic recovery. So thank you very much for being here with us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce our partner at this event, Dan Kelly, the President and CEO of the CFIB. Dan, over to you.
You would think after 2,000 Zoom calls, I would know how to take myself off of mute. Welcome, everybody. It's great that you've joined us and our partners Intuit QuickBooks for this event. David, we've been just so pleased to work with your awesome team over at Intuit QuickBooks and are really, really proud of our ongoing partnerships. For members of CFIB, please do check them out. They've been just doing an awesome job for small and medium-sized companies. I also want to welcome the MPs who are with us today. Super grateful to you for taking the time out of your busy election campaigns to join us. We have from the Liberal Party, Sean Fraser, from the Conservative Party, Ed Fast, and from the NDP, Peter Julian. My colleagues will be introducing them with a little bit more detail in just a moment. I'm also really grateful that all the small business owners on this call, all our guests, have taken the time too. I should note that we invited all parties with MPs in the House of Commons to this discussion. The Green Party didn't respond to our request, but the Bloc Québécois did say that they will participate, and we're going to have a similar version of this in French tomorrow. Wish me luck with my stilted French for that, but we're going to be doing that tomorrow afternoon. I want to remind everyone that CFIB, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, is a strictly nonpartisan organization, and our goal is to provide you with information that you might find useful when making your electoral decisions. We've also, in addition to this town hall that we're doing today, we've asked all the parties to provide written feedback on issues of importance to small business. And I'm pleased to say that we now have all six major political parties. The three that are here today, the Conservatives, Liberals, and NDP, together with the Bloc Québécois, the People's Party, and the Green Party just last night. But they've now sent us information that we're going to then populate on CFIB's website. And so all the three other major parties that are not with us this afternoon we will have information for you to pour through as you make your decisions. We're going to post all of those responses very, very soon. CFIB is going to use all of this feedback, our discussion today, and the written commitments from the parties, their platforms included, to hold a government and to hold all political parties accountable for the commitments that they make to small businesses in the next number of years. And you know, the last week's English leaders debate was certainly very helpful, but it only touched on small business or economic issues really in the last 5 minutes of a 2-hour debate. And that's one of the reasons why we're so happy to be hosting this event, because we do need to delve into some of the issues that are important to small business in a bit more detail. So before I turn things over to my colleagues and the candidates from the major parties, I just want to set the stage a little bit. The pandemic has had a massive impact on Canada's small business community. Even at this late stage, now what, a year and a half into the pandemic, only 76% of small businesses are fully open. Less than half of our small business community has been able to bring back all of their staff, in part because of a growing shortage of labor. And probably most worrisome of all, only 39% of small firms are at normal levels of sales. So for them, the pandemic is very much still on and having a profound effect on their business's future. The news is also troubling because the average small firm has inherited over $170,000 in fresh debt related to COVID. 180,000 firms, almost 1 in 6 businesses we believe to be at risk of permanent closure. And while the pandemic support programs have been helpful, they've only covered about a third of the losses for the average small business, and many, including new businesses, have not been able to qualify for any of the support programs that are out there. So I look forward to hearing how all the platforms of each party will help small businesses through the remainder of this pandemic, and then get small businesses back to doing what they do best, and that is creating jobs and building the economy in their local communities. I'd now like to introduce my colleagues, Corinne Pohlmann, who is CFIB's Senior Vice President of National Affairs and Partnerships, as well as Laura Jones, CFIB's Executive Vice President and Chief Strategic Officer. Laura and Corinne, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's Laura Jones, and I'm the Executive Vice President for CFIB. Really pleased to be here with everyone today. And before I turn it over to Corinne to introduce our candidates, I want to just explain the format of today's town hall, and I can assure you it is considerably less complicated than the English debate format last week. So we're going to keep things simple. And Corinne and I plan to ask the same question to each candidate. So each candidate has an opportunity to answer the same question. And the questions come from you, our small business audience. So thank you to all of you who took the time to put in some questions as you registered for the event. You will also be able to put in some questions there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And if we have time, we will get to some of those questions. So if you have comments or questions that you want to put in there, please feel free to do that. And if we have time, we will get to those as well. For the candidates, we're encouraging candidates to get to the point, and we're giving them a maximum of 2 minutes. So encouraging them to be brief and concise in their answers to our questions. I've come up with a very high-tech way of managing this. So at the 2-minute mark, you will see a red card, and you don't want to see too many of these, because then you might force me to get really high tech and start searching for my mute button, which could be a challenge. So we're also going to rotate who goes first in answering the questions, and so you'll see that. And finally, I just want to let everyone know that this is being recorded, and as Dan mentioned, we have a web page. You can check us out at cfib.ca/federal-election. And we will have the recording of this as well as some other information, and I'll mention that again at the end. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Corinne, who is going to introduce the candidate and the candidates, and then we will be back to start asking some questions.
Very good. Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you are in the country today. We're really pleased, as everybody has mentioned so far, to have the candidates join us here today. So without further ado, let us jump into who they actually are. So with us today, first is Peter Julian. He is the NDP candidate for New Westminster, Burnaby, British Columbia. He was first elected to the House of Commons in 2004. Prior to the election, he was serving as the NDP finance critic and House leader. He was born and raised in New Westminster, Burnaby area, so he has stuck close to his roots, and where his family has lived actually for 4 generations, which is quite something. Peter graduated with the University of Quebec in Montreal, with a degree in political science, specializing in international relations, and has worked previous to being elected as a financial administrator and worked with the Western Institute for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. He's also been instrumental in building the British Columbia Disability Employment Network, a consortium of community groups, organizations, and not-profit societies dedicated to serving people with disabilities. So welcome, Peter. I'm very glad you're here. Next, we have Ed Fast. He is the Conservative candidate representing Abbotsford, BC. Yes, we have 2 candidates for British Columbia. It just turned out that way. But Ed was first elected in the House of Commons in 2006. And was re-elected in the next 4 elections. And just prior to the election being called, he was serving as the finance critic for the Conservatives and was the Minister of International Trade between 2011 and 2015. He had previously served 2 terms as an Abbotsford School trustee and for 3 terms as a member of Abbotsford City Council. He's a graduate of the University of British Columbia and has practiced corporate and commercial law in Abbotsford for 24 years. Ed and his wife Annette live in Abbotsford and have 4 married daughters and 11 grandchildren. That'll keep you busy. And next we have Sean Fraser. Sean Fraser is the Liberal candidate representing Central Nova Scotia. So we have both coasts well represented here. Sean was first elected to the House of Commons in 2015. Just prior to the election, he was serving as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Minister and Minister of Finance, and to the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity and Associate Minister of Finance. So we have all of the finance folks here with us today. Sean graduated with a law degree from Dalhousie University and had a successful legal career with one of Canada's top-ranked law firms prior to running for office. He's also a longtime volunteer, having served with a local branch of the United Nations Association of Canada and provided pro bono legal services to Boys and Girls Clubs and underprivileged community members. He enjoys spending time with his wife Sarah and his daughter Molly, and unwinds with his guitar or bagpipes, which apparently he's been playing for over 20 years. So that's great to hear. The bagpipes are one of those great instruments. I'm always amazed that people know how to play them. Thank you, Sean, for joining us. We're going to get started with our first question, and I'm going to go back over to Laura to pose the first question to our candidates.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. So I thought we'd start with something to help the audience get to know each of you a little bit better. And of course, over the past 18 months, it's been such a challenging time for everyone, really, a very challenging time, we know, for small businesses. And it's caused a lot of people to reflect on what's important. And with that context in mind, I thought I'd ask by asking each of you, and we'll start with you, Peter, what's motivating you to run for political office?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for hosting this forum. I'd like to start off by acknowledging I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Kakite First Nation and the Coast Salish peoples. And I also want to say that what galvanized me to go into politics is very much what motivates folks who are operating small businesses across the country. I first ran with Jack Layton, and Jack Layton, of course, had operated a small business and felt keenly the importance of reinforcing small businesses across the country. Jagmeet Singh feels exactly the same way, and he wanted me to bring greetings all the small business people right across the country that are part of this forum today. I am keenly connected to our small businesses in New Westminster Burnaby, and we felt through COVID that the NDP's role with the balance of power was to force the government to respond properly to the challenges that small businesses were facing. So as you know, Jagmeet Singh pushed, and the NDP pushed, for a 75% wage subsidy. The initial government offer was 10%, simply not adequate to maintain jobs. Gord Johns, who is our critic of our small businesses, worked closely with Ann Kelly and the CFIB to get a rent subsidy program that actually made sense. The initial one that was rolled out simply didn't work for small businesses. And as a result, we were able to obtain a rent subsidy program that does meet the needs of many of the small businesses in my riding. When you go around New Westminster Burnaby, you'll see a lot of small businesses with the NDP sign. Why is that? Well, because what we're offering are things that small businesses feel keenly about. We are saying that, for example, with interchange fees, the federal government should be making sure, capping it like other countries do, so that small businesses don't pay an arm and a leg. A price cap on data plans and cell phones, also helping small businesses. Bank fees being capped, also helping small businesses. And making sure that there's fairness. That's what the NDP is all about.
Thank you, and thank you for sticking to your for getting us off on the right track with respect to the time. Ed, I'm going to go to you now.
Well, thank you. And I believe the question was focused on us introducing ourselves and what prompted us to get into politics. And in my case, it was my father. Back in 1964, there was a US presidential election, Goldwater versus President Johnson. And my father sat me down in front of a black and white grainy television set and said, "Son, tonight I'm going to explain to you what politics is." And he talked to me about Americans making a decision that night that would determine the future course of their history. He explained to me what public service was about and that was something worthy to aspire to. So of the 8 kids in our family, I was the one that actually carried on with a political interest. And I attribute that moment in my life to effectively planting the seed of interest in politics. My member of parliament back then was John Fraser, former fisheries minister, became the Speaker of the House of Commons. And I thought to myself, someday I would love to serve the way John is serving in Ottawa. Now, when I graduated from university and got married, my wife and I quickly had 4 daughters. We had moved out to Abbotsford, and I realized that being away from home 50% of the year was just not going to be conducive to family life. So I got involved in local politics, school board, city council. And then one day, Randy White announced that he was retiring. So in 2006, I was elected the member of parliament for Abbotsford. And I really enjoyed my time, especially in the Harper government, being the Minister of International Trade, connecting with small businesses across our country, finding a way to open up new markets for them all around the world. So I'm excited for our discussion today and talking about how we can support businesses better in the future as we emerge from the COVID pandemic.
Thanks so much. And Sean, same question for you. What's motivating you to run for political office?
Look, thanks so much, Peter, Ed, and all of the members of CFIB who've joined us today. And before I answer the question, let me just provide a quick update to that bio. I realize it's a bit outdated because it's now pushing 30 years I've been playing the bagpipes, but far more importantly, we've added another child to our family. We have a new son, Jack, who's just about 8 weeks old, and that's been an interesting thing to be dealing with on the campaign trail at the same time. Look, to answer your question, what motivated me to get involved in politics? When I made the decision to run for office back in 2015, I was working in a commercial litigation practice in Calgary, where everybody I went to high school seemed to be living at the time, even though we grew up in a small town in Nova Scotia. I grew up in a small community with a big family. I've got 5 sisters. And when I was thinking about the decision to leave a job that I really loved, working in the private sector in law, I started thinking about the place that I came from and thinking about the impact that the economic opportunity or lack thereof had on the community that gave me so much. My oldest sister was a doctor. She'd been practicing in Ontario. My next oldest sister is running a chiropractic business, and she moved to Ontario. 2 of my other sisters who were teachers but weren't able to get work at home and had to move away. And my youngest sister was an accountant working for a big accounting firm who couldn't find work in the community that we came from. I made a decision at the time that if I could do something to create more opportunities for young people and families to actually choose to continue to work and succeed in the area that we came from, I thought that'd be something meaningful I could do with my life. Over the past couple of years, we've actually seen a really serious uptick in our fortunes in Atlantic Canada with business growth, more young people coming back home. And what I'm starting to see is the policies that we pass in Ottawa make a very big difference, not only for the economic opportunity, but for the quality of life that people get to enjoy. So focusing on growing that economic opportunity for people to choose to live in the communities where they come from, doing more to fight climate change and protect the environment, and making sure that the policies that we adopt don't just foster growth, but make sure that growth works for everyone. Those are the things that get me out of bed every day when I decide I'm going to go to work, and I'm thrilled to be putting my name on the ballot again to continue to pursue some of those outcomes through elected office.
Great. Thank you, Sean. So we're now going to move into the tougher questions, which have come from our members. And I'm going to pose a question that Myra from BC asked, but it's actually very similar to literally dozens and dozens of other questions, including some we're already getting on the Q&A right now. Myra asked, she basically said, we appreciate and thank the current government for their financial help over the last 18 months. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic restrictions, we have always qualified for the maximum subsidy rates and have heavily relied on the subsidies. And she's asking a couple of things. She's asking, are you planning on extending CEWS and CERS, so the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy and the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy, as well as keeping the rates the same as they currently are? And also asking, will you extend and or present different terms for the Canada Emergency Business Account loans so that we can be assured we will not lose the forgivable portion of the loan? And I'm going to add a third piece to that, and it's come up already on the Q&A, and that is new businesses who are not able to access any of these programs. any plans to sort of help some of those folks? So essentially, what can we do to help reassure so many small businesses that are still struggling due to the pandemic? Let's start this question with Sean.
First of all, let me say thank you, because the programs that Myra, I believe it was, referred to, they weren't invented in isolation by politicians sitting behind closed boardroom doors. We came up with ideas to start, and I think one of the strengths of the pandemic response was we actually engaged with groups including CFIB, including businesses across Canada, to adjust those programs to meet the needs of businesses where they flagged for us that there were concerns that we're going to actually help them stay open. Our mission from the beginning of the pandemic has been to try to defeat COVID-19, support households and businesses through the pandemic, and as we transition to a reopening, try to put measures in place that will actually foster growth on the back end of COVID-19. So if you allow me to be a little bit more specific to the question around the wage subsidy and the rent subsidy, we've got flexibility to extend those programs into November, and we'll be looking at what the situation is with the virus at the time to make sure that we don't prematurely yank supports from different businesses. But as we've announced on our platform, we have an intention to move forward with more tailored responses that are going to help businesses succeed on the back end of this pandemic. So if we look at a wage subsidy for some of the hardest hit sectors that have not yet fully recovered or come close to fully recovering, I'm thinking tourism and hospitality and the arts, we have unique programs that's actually going to extend those benefits into the next tourism season. Similarly, when it comes to the arts, we've got a program that's going to have a matching program for revenue when people host live events, because we know they're going to be dealing with social distancing and won't be able to pack those halls the way that they have before. Of course, as well, as we see some of the benefits for like the Canada Recovery benefit going down in value, we've got new programs coming on like the Canada Recovery Hiring Incentive to help cover a portion of the cost of adding payroll so you can bring workers back as you seek to reopen. Now, on the question about financing with CEBA loans and with some of the new business programs, we don't think that the measures we put in place before are match precisely the needs of what businesses are going to need going forward. So we've actually come up with a suite of new programs to actually tailor them to the needs that businesses are telling us about today. So increasing the small business financing program from $350,000 to $500,000, creating new policies that are going to allow us to immediately write down the capital cost for machinery, for intellectual property, for software, different expenses like that. But for new businesses, a lot of the programs that we've come up with in the platform will be eligible for everyone. Programs around digital adoption, allowing them to get into online marketplaces, programs that are allowing them to hire young Canadians to help get their businesses online, and programs like the small business financing program. Every step of the way, we're trying to tailor the programs for what the situation is on the ground, because the number one threat to the Canadian economy remains COVID-19. And as we seek to transition to an open economy, the needs of businesses that are speaking with me are a little bit different than they were at the first of the pandemic.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Peter, same question to you.
Well, thanks very much. And from the very beginning, we fought to have the 75% wage subsidy in place. This was something that we saw in other countries was working very effectively. And so we wanted to make sure the initial government proposal was a 10% wage subsidy. It simply wasn't adequate to support small businesses. So we fought for a 75% wage subsidy. For the rent subsidy, as I mentioned earlier with Gord Johns, the initial offering was so complicated, most small businesses couldn't actually access it. So we fought to make sure the rent subsidy was in place and actually provided those supports. Now, what happened through the budget implementation is very clearly the government is cutting back on these supports. And we are not in agreement with that. The NDP, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP caucus do not believe that this is the time to slash those supports when it comes to individuals or when it comes to small businesses. So the NDP platform, which came out, the fiscal plan came out on the weekend. All of this, of course, vetted by the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer, who is the independent officer of Parliament that basically calls the parties and calls the government on whether or not the fiscal plans make sense. The Parliamentary Budgetary Officer has said that the NDP plan, which increases revenues, particularly for corporations that are not paying tax now, the big corporations, actually has the lowest deficit. And at the same time, within that fiscal plan, we extend till the end of the fiscal year into 2022, the provisions for the rent subsidy and the wage subsidy. So we are very focused on small businesses. We do believe that there needs to be a revision to enhance those supports for new businesses and also the SEPA loans. But we believe the government is bringing an end prematurely to these supports that small businesses still need.
Great, thank you, Peter. Over to you, Ed. How will the Conservatives help all those small businesses that are still struggling due to COVID-19 with the supports starting to disappear?
Well, let me answer your question directly. We have no plans to wind down the CEWS and the service program until it is safe to do so and until small businesses have actually safely made it through the recession. But we have, in fact, turned our minds to how all of this ends, because as my colleagues have suggested, the circumstances today are quite different than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. And at some point in time, emergency support programs will have to be wound down as the recovery sets in. We have said that we will wind down these emergency pandemic supports in a responsible and compassionate way as the recovery takes root. So we have to have a recovering economy first. And once the CEWS program ends, we will be introducing the Canada Job Surge Plan, which will help Canadians get back to work. That program will actually pay employers at least 25% of the salary of net new hires for a period of 6 months after CEWS expires, and to help those who have been unemployed long-term, which is a special problem. Our plan will cover up to 50% of the salary of those who have been unemployed for 6 months or more. Now, you asked a third question. I'll quickly respond to that. A number of the emergency support measures were actually poorly designed. And yes, you are correct that new businesses slipped through the cracks because they didn't qualify. They didn't have a history of revenues that they could use to support their claims. We are committed to reviewing those programs, making sure that they actually do what they were intended to do, support all Canadian businesses that require the support, and to do so in a responsible way. We saw that also with the CERB program, which is now resulting in employers having difficulty getting their workers back on the job. Again, a design flaw that we hope to remedy when we're in government.
Great, thank you, Ed. And that's actually a great segue into our next question, which comes from Kelly from Ontario. Kelly asked, basically she said it's been impossible to hire staff this past year. We are being told to increase what we pay, or it's not worth it to go back to work because of CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. This is and has been an incredible hardship on our company and many others. Some have actually closed their doors for good. How will you help? So essentially, how can you help these businesses who are struggling now with a shortage of labor? And we're going to start with you, Ed.
Well, I think I've already signaled where we want to go as a Conservative government. That is to review all of the emergency support programs to make sure that the design of those programs is refined to actually do what we wanted to do, which is to support workers through this very difficult time. But when the time is right and employers want those workers back, those workers actually are incentivized to go back to their employers. If we don't do that, we're exacerbating an already difficult situation with our labor force. We have the baby boomers that are rapidly exiting the labor force. That hole is not being backfilled enough. So we're going to have to look at immigration. We're going to have to look at women in the workforce. We're going to have to look at minority communities. We have a real challenge here, and it's going to require a very focused government that will make the tough decisions to reposition our economy so that we can have a robust economy and ensure the long-term prosperity of our country.
Thank you, Ed. Sean, what would the Liberal Party do to help deal with the shortage of qualified?
Look, thank you, and this is a real problem, but just before I begin, I just want to respectfully disagree with my colleague, Mr. Fast, on 2 points that he had raised. He described the extension potentially under the Conservatives to the wage subsidy and rent subsidy, but that's not actually in the costed platform they've put forward. And the job search plan that he referred to is essentially a similar but potentially less generous version of the Canada Recovery Hiring Incentive, which is already in place. But on the labor shortage, this is a big issue. It comes up at home all the time. When we first introduced CERB, we wanted people to stay home so they wouldn't spread the virus. The equation has changed over time as we're trying to reopen the economy. And that's why, as the benefit of the new and more restricted Canada Recovery benefit is winding down, we've got new benefits like the Canada Recovering Hiring Incentive that are coming online to encourage businesses to bring people back on payroll. But it's not unique when you have the entire country trying to hire from the same pool of labor at the same time as we reopen, which has never happened in my lifetime before. This is a pretty unique situation, that there is going to be a crunch on the labor market. There's not going to be a silver bullet that will solve this problem. That's why we've got a suite of policies in place that are designed to tackle it. Our plan to introduce universal and affordable access to childcare is expected to bring about 250,000 new workers into the labor force. We've got programs through our different immigration streams, economic immigration streams, that are going to help businesses find talent that is not currently available in their community or potentially across Canada. We've got changes to skills development and training opportunities. It's actually going to help about 500,000 Canadians find the skills they need that are actually available in the marketplace today. These are the kinds of programs that are actually tailored to deal with the problems that we're seeing across the economy right now. We have to be aware that it's not simply the generosity of the CRB that's solely responsible for this. There's been a lot of job switching that's gone on during this pandemic, where a worker who's been laid off due to public health restrictions has taken a job with another employer. And when everybody opens back up, that worker has found a different job, and the skills that they had may not be available in the labor pool. So by focusing on immigration streams, by extending access to childcare, by putting a financial incentive for employers who bring more people on payroll, and by investing heavily in training opportunities, we hope to solve this problem.
Thank you, Sean. Peter.
Well, thank you. I don't think the problems in the labor market can be attributed to CERB. Certainly when I talk to small businesses in my area, there are other things that come to light. First off, the issue of housing affordability. Many of the small businesses in New Westminster Burnaby don't have staff that can live where they are working. And so the NDP plan for housing affordability to actually put the federal government back in the business of making sure affordable homes are built right across the country, something that was ended by the former Liberal government when the National Housing Program was eliminated, is something that we desperately need. And what the NDP has been proposing will help in a very significant way to address that. Dental care and pharmacare, these are things that small businesses are obliged to pay. For pharmacare, it's about a $6 billion annual charge to businesses. And because the Liberals reneged on their commitment to put in place public universal pharmacare, we know that that's a major competitive advantage. We'll have a competitive advantage of about $600 per employee per company. So for small businesses, putting in place dental care and putting in place pharmacare helps in a very significant way. And providing more support so that the barriers that we face to post-secondary education, take a qualified staff, is something that needs to change. And the NDP plan for access to post-secondary education will make a huge difference in having younger people actually being able to go on to college and university and trade school and get the skills of tomorrow. The other element in terms of the labor market is credential recognition. We have many qualified new Canadians who come here, and because neither the former Conservative nor the present Liberal government has done anything for their credentials to be recognized in Canada, those are qualified applicants that can't actually perform the skills that they have. Those things need to change.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Number of pretty interesting ideas coming from all the parties when it comes to the shortage of labor issues. One I would agree doesn't have a simple solution, but obviously one that is very important and certainly growing among our membership. We hear about it almost every day. So thank you for all of your answers on that one. We're going to move to one more question, then I'll pass it back over to Laura. This question is coming from Evan, also from British Columbia. Evan was asking, tax on split income, or what we used to know as TOSI, and other taxation changes have had a big impact on many small business owners. What taxation plans do you have that may impact small businesses and their owners? And we're going to start with you, Peter, on this question.
Thank you very much. And so what the NDP foresees is no change to small business taxes. We were a strong promoter, of course, of the tax changes that allow family businesses to be passed from one generation to the next. Happily, a Conservative MP picked up what Guy Caron for the NDP had brought forward in the House of Commons, and that is now the law of the land. We believe in those kinds of changes that are significant, but we also believe for the small business tax rate that it should not be changed. Now, that being said, in terms of overall tax changes, we do believe if we're going to make the investments that we are talking about, like public universal pharmacare and dental care, making sure that we have affordable housing in this country, and encouraging access to post-secondary education, these are all changes that have a very positive impact on small businesses. But to pay for it, we need to actually have in place a fair tax system. And so the NDP has been promoting the idea of a wealth tax. Countries like Norway and Switzerland have this in place. And of course, it makes a big difference for their competitiveness because of the investments that the national government can make. We also believe in cracking down in overseas tax havens. The Parliamentary Budgetary Officer indicates we lose $25 billion in tax revenues every year to overseas tax havens. And after 6 years, the Liberals have not had a single prosecution for what is rampant tax evasion. That's not fair to small businesses who pay their taxes, who make sure that they're being fair to their community, and yet some of the big players are getting by without paying any taxes at all. And of course, the web giants, often competing with small businesses, get off tax-free. These are not acceptable. And so our tax regime would be very predictable for small businesses, but we would be making sure the giants pay their fair share.
Thank you, Peter. Over to you, Ed. What do you have to say about taxation and small business?
Well, I am vaguely familiar with the TOSI rules, which apply the highest marginal tax rate to income that's split. And of course, those rules are changing. They're continuing to evolve. Just as a rule, we as Conservatives do not believe that increasing taxes on small and medium-sized businesses is the way to address the looming financial and fiscal challenges created by the pandemic. We believe that instead, the next government should have a singular focus on addressing the systemic weaknesses in our economy and on generating growth to create the tax base we need to sustain our way of life. And we have signaled that a Conservative government would undertake comprehensive tax and regulatory reform to make sure that our tax system is fair, that people pay their fair share, but that we also provide a welcoming, nurturing environment within which small business can thrive and that will attract investment from abroad. And I do want to note that it was previous Conservative governments, specifically the Harper government, that actually introduced income splitting for families. So we have a record. I always like to believe that past performance predicts future performance. We are the party of reducing the tax burden on businesses, on families. And it was our Conservative MP, Larry Maguire, who brought forward Bill C-208, which finally allowed parents to transfer their businesses to their kids on the same tax basis as he transferred to an arm's length purchaser. And the Liberals opposed that in the House of Commons. In fact, even when the legislation had been passed and was supposed to come into effect, our Prime Minister said, we're not going to respect that law. And finally, he was forced to back down because we called his officials to the Finance Committee.
Thank you, Ed. And Sean, what about the Liberal response to taxation and small business?
So look, I actually am pleased to see that there's some common ground between the parties when it comes to small and medium sized businesses and the role that tax should play. This is not a good time to be pulling money out of the economy and out of businesses through taxation. We reduced the small business tax rate from initially 11, then it went to 10.5 and down to 9%. Which is the lowest in the G7, and we will be maintaining the lowest small business tax rate of any G7 economy. We have no plans whatsoever to be increasing taxes on small and medium-sized businesses. For digital web giants, for some of the banks and insurance companies that have profited more than $1 billion over the course of the pandemic, we do think it's appropriate to ask them to cover some of the shortfalls so we can fund some of the programs that have benefited small and medium-sized businesses, which I think are going to drive growth as we come out of this pandemic. What we're trying to do, though, rather than looking to small businesses to pay more tax, we're actually trying to spend the government's revenue in a way that's going to help small and medium-sized businesses grow and add workers to their payroll so we can get the economy roaring back. The kinds of programs, and I've canvassed some of them before, include affordable access to childcare at $10 a day, to have 250,000 parents join the workforce. Programs like the Canada Recovering Hiring Incentive, which is actually going to cut the costs in half for people who qualify that are actually adding to their payroll. We're putting new tax measures in place that are actually going to reduce the cost to business by allowing them to immediately write off capital expenditures on equipment, investments in intellectual property, investments in software or other components of their business that's actually going to help them grow. It's growth, growth, growth. What we really need to do is help businesses find workers and encourage them to make the kinds of investments that will allow them to achieve growth. When it comes, by the way, to the C208 and intergenerational transfers, we have no objection in principle to what's going on. We are going to be maintaining the protection for intergenerational transfers from parents to kids. There's a few loopholes we need to close to make sure that it's not used by people purely for the tax basis, but we do want to protect the right of businesses to sell on even keel with third parties.
Great, thank you, Sean. And I just want to reiterate before I hand it over to Laura that the taxation question is a broad one, and thank you all for keeping within your time limits as we were going through this. But the costs of just doing business today in Canada are going up, and taxation is one piece of that, but so is many other costs around PPEs and dealing with new restrictions that are coming on them, as well as supply chain issues. So keep in mind, all the parties, please, about those ongoing costs that are coming at small businesses going forward. So just wanted to leave with that. And Laura, I'll turn over to you for the next question.
Well, maybe I'll build off that theme, Corinne, and we'll come to deficits in a minute. But before we get there, talking about other costs, we know that for small businesses, taxation is their number one preoccupation, but their number two preoccupation and labor and skills shortages that we've talked about also very, very important for small businesses across Canada. And we're hearing a lot about that right now. But consistently number two in our 50-year history has been regulation and specifically red tape, because small businesses have no objection to the legitimate regulations that are needed to keep, protect human health, safety, the environment. But we know there's a portion of the regulatory burden that can be best described as red tape. And I'm talking about things that aren't in plain language or rules that are contradictory or just make no sense. And so maybe I'll start by asking, where is this on the priority list for your parties? And are there any specific plans you want to comment on? Because of course that increases the cost to small business, and it is a regressive tax in the sense that smaller businesses face bigger burdens than bigger businesses on this. And I'll go to you first, Sean, on this.
Sure. Look, I hear about this all the time. I live in a community that doesn't have a lot of big businesses. We have a few big industrial players, and Sobeys is headquartered in my riding. With those exceptions, the entire economy around here is either primary industry or small and medium-sized businesses. The bread and butter for the community that I represent is machine shops. It's the mom and pop store on Main Street. We have a few growing tech businesses that maybe have 20, 30 employees. And every minute that they spend on complying with regulations that isn't for a very clear health and safety outcome is a minute they're not growing their business. And it's a huge source of frustration. We launched back in 2018 a targeted review of the regulatory approval process across different segments of government to see if we can actually trim areas that aren't adding some social, economic, or environmental value from a regulatory point of view. We've adopted a reciprocal approval process so that products or initiatives in one jurisdiction that have been approved could be expedited in Canada. We've got a new policy that we do internally when we form new regulation, that we specifically have to consider how those regulations are going to impact small businesses. I'm thinking about the small farms in my riding that have different regulatory approval process for food inspection for provincial governments and for federal governments, and some of them are restricted only to selling at their farm gate because they can't get into grocery stores. These are the kinds of things that we're trying to do differently. If I look at environmental policy, there's a good sort of contrast between what we and the Conservatives are pitching. Everyone agrees now, all the major parties, that carbon pricing has to be a part of the path forward to reduce our emissions. We've put a benchmark price, you pay that price, and that's it. When I look at what Mr. O'Toole's pitched, it's a very complicated regulatory framework that's going to require businesses to separate the expenditures from the fuel that's purchased at the pump and the Gatorade you buy inside the store. It's hard to understand where you're going to allow businesses to delve into a person's personal spending to see where the transaction came from. And I think this is going to be a nightmare for small operators at convenience stores that are attached to gas stations. These are the kind of things we're really trying to avoid, because we know we want businesses to focus on selling more of their products and making more things rather than filling out more forms. And that's part of the path to success going forward for the businesses and the communities I represent.
Thanks so much. Peter, we're going to go to you next.
Thanks very much. And certainly we need to have a dynamic federal government. We haven't had that in many, many decades, that is capable of moving forward and eliminating duplicate or contradictory regulations that make it difficult for small businesses. It's simply part of what should be an effective federal government approach to move forward and make sure that regulations that no longer serve any useful purpose or that are contradictory to other regulations are actually eliminated or streamlined, because that allows for small businesses to prosper and create jobs in the community. Now, that being said, I would also make the argument that there are very important good regulations, and we need a government that is dynamic enough to recognize the difference. Health and safety regulations are one good example of that. Another good example of that is the fact that we have an absence of regulation for a whole variety of very large businesses that essentially are ripping off small businesses in this country. So we have announced, for example, that the internet merchant fees that are basically the sky's the limit for Visa and MasterCard, they have a huge impact on local businesses. Charlie and Liberty, just up the street, they have an NDP sign, and they say that most of their profit goes to the credit card companies because there has been no regulation. Other countries have regulations in that regard. We would cap it at 1%. That helps small businesses. Canadians pay some of the highest prices for data and cell phones in the entire world. And we would also cap those fees and ensure unlimited data. This makes a difference. These are the kinds of regulations for the big players that actually really help small businesses. And the banks, of course, they have impunity on bank fees. We would actually rein in the banks and force them to serve the public interest a lot more. These are good regulations that would make a difference for small businesses.
Thank you. And Ed, same question to you. Where is this on your government's priority list, dealing with red tape, and are there any concrete initiatives that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, thank you for that question. And I believe the question was focused on how do we address overregulation, the government's role in interfering in what businesses do best, which is to create jobs and opportunity across Canada. And right off the top, I already mentioned that we are the only party right now that has baked into our platform a commitment to comprehensive tax and regulatory reform. Now, that's going to require significant collaboration across our country, because the provinces are implicated, even municipalities implicated. And we have the complicating factor of having significant interprovincial trade barriers, which add even more regulatory red tape to the burden that small and medium-sized businesses have to carry. So you should expect that early on in a conservative mandate, you would see a firm step forward in implementing a regulatory review. There are thousands upon thousands of regulations at the federal government level. When you layer those upon the provincial regulations, it is almost impossible for our businesses to extricate themselves from that entanglement. We need to simplify the nature of doing business in Canada. Not only are we making it difficult for Canadian businesses, we are chasing away foreign investment in our country because Canada is no longer considered to be a good place to do business in. Shame on us for allowing that to happen.
Okay, I'm going to sneak in one quick question and ask everyone to be quick before I turn it back to Corinne and give you all a chance to make some wrap-up comments. And the last question is on deficit. And so Terry from Nova Scotia is asking, what time frame does your party intend to get back to a balanced budget? And Ed, I'm going to go back to you to take this one first, and then we'll go to Sean and Peter.
Well, I wish I were the last one to respond to this because I suspect that both my colleagues will not answer that question. We have said very clearly that we have a plan to balance the budget within a 10-year time frame. The current government is spending close to $500 million a day more than we can afford. In other words, more than the money that we bring in taxes. And quite frankly, by their silence, and through their finance minister's silence, have admitted, the Liberals have admitted that they have no plan whatsoever to balance the budget at any time in the future. In fact, the independent, nonpartisan parliamentary budget officer has determined that at its current pace, the Trudeau government will not return to balanced budgets until the year 2070. That's 70. And that's without introducing any more permanent spending programs in the future. That's unlikely that they'll comply with that. So at some point in time, like households, we have to live within our means. We're the only party with a plan to achieve that. We will adopt a responsible and measured approach to balancing the budget over the next decade by doing three things: reining in deficits to address inflation and the rising cost of necessity, winding down emergency pandemic supports in a responsible and compassionate way as the recovery takes root, and then investing in targeted stimulus measures such as infrastructure, things like broadband and roads and bridges and things that improve our competitiveness as a country to create jobs and improve the quality of life here in Canada.
Thank you. Sean, you're next. Time frame for balancing the budget.
Look, you'll forgive me if I disagree with the criticisms that my colleague Ed put forward of our government. I find it's helpful when you're looking at fiscal management to not just look at what the parties are saying, although I will point out the Conservatives' own numbers suggest they'll run larger deficits in the years ahead than we have planned. But the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy, Kevin Page's organization, recently put out a ranking of the party's fiscal plan going forward. And he put us with a score of 86% compared to 64 for the Conservatives and 56 for the NDP. The reality is right now, putting a marker out there saying this is the specific date that we're going to balance the budget runs the risk of actually doing something that's fiscally irresponsible. What we need to be doing is securing the economy before we start to focus on eliminating completely the deficit. It's really important that we have focused measures that are going to help spur growth. Ed mentioned digital infrastructure and connecting Canadians online. I agree, except the Conservative platform doesn't actually have any costing for those kinds of expenses. The kind of focus that we're bringing is on things like childcare, is on things like housing, is on things like reaching net zero, because we know that's where the biggest growth opportunities are. And to criticize us on the deficit that's been built up to date, I would like to ask, what is the alternative? Because the pandemic, as Kevin Milligan, a professor at the University of British Columbia, testified before the Finance Committee, where the gentlemen who were part of this today's event with me both said, he explained that the pandemic created an immense amount of debt. It was the government's decision to let households, businesses, or government bear that debt. We have favorable interest rates. We have the ability to handle it. And had we not been there to support households and businesses, the impact on our debt to GDP ratio would have effectively put us in the same place with a much, much lower ability to bounce back because so many businesses would have gone bankrupt. We were there for businesses through this pandemic. We're going to be there for them through the recovery. When we're looking at what's fiscally responsible, it's making sure that we preserve the economic potential that Canada holds so we can have a robust recovery and get Canadians back to work. This is the way that we plan to move forward, and all of the numbers are laid out in a transparent way in our fully costed platform. I invite folks to read the report from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to answer the question.
Thanks. And over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much. As Ed points out, the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer is the independent officer of Parliament who's evaluated all of the spending plans. And what he says is the NDP's plan actually has the smallest deficit. The Liberals and Conservatives have larger deficits through their fiscal plan. Now, why is that? Well, the NDP is making more investments that actually help people and help small businesses, but we're actually tackling the revenue side, the web giants that don't pay a cent of taxes. $25 billion a year that go to overseas tax havens. And the fact that Canada's billionaires have increased their wealth during this pandemic by $80 billion and are not paying taxes on those amounts. In the Second World War, we had a fair tax system. We had an excess profits tax. We had a wealth tax. And that allowed us to have that unprecedented level of prosperity coming after the Second World War. NDP will take that proven approach that you have to balance revenues and expenditures. And the reality is that our debt to GDP ratio under the NDP plan continues to fall. I would like to point out something else, and it's found in the fiscal period returns that are produced by the National Finance Ministry, the Federal Ministry of Finance, certainly not a hotbed of the NDP. But if you look over the last 30 years of fiscal period returns, the Federal Finance Ministry actually indicates that NDP governments are the best at managing money, the best at balancing budgets and paying down debt. Because we take care of the revenue side, because we actually, instead of letting lobbyists decide that big corporations can get off scot-free, we actually balance revenue and expenditures. So we're able to make more investments that make a difference in the lives of your customers and ultimately make a difference in small businesses and small business prosperity. So it's a different approach, it's a more effective approach, and the PBO says the NDP deficit will be the smallest among the three major parties.
Corinne, bring us home.
All right, so we only have a few minutes left. So we do want each of you to give us sort of a final few words and keep it really short, maybe a minute each, to sort of wrap up why a small business should vote for your party. Let's start with you, Peter, on this one.
Thank you. You're paying too much for cell and data. You're paying too much when it comes to merchant fees. You're paying too much in bank fees. And these are all things that have a huge impact on your small business. We've had the sort of a laissez-faire approach for decades, and that hasn't helped small businesses. The NDP approach is different. We would actually make sure that those major players start to treat small businesses with respect. And ultimately, when we talk about the labor market or other challenges, we would be ensuring that there are more investments in the hands of your customers, in your local communities, making sure that people, rather than struggling to pay for housing or to put food on the table, actually have the wherewithal to be more determined customers of your business. We believe in community businesses. I come from that sector, won a couple of business excellence awards, and we believe that small businesses can really be supported by the investments that we make in your community.
Thank you, Peter. Ed, 1 minute. Tell us why small business should vote for the Conservatives.
Well, thank you, Corinne and Laura and Dan, for the opportunity for all of us as colleagues in the House of Commons to share a little bit of what our vision for the future is, especially when it comes to small businesses. And I believe the question that your viewers should ask themselves, who do you trust to actually manage the economy and to get the finances of this nation back in order? You have a prime minister, you have a Liberal government that made promises after promise. More promises have been broken by this prime minister than any other prime minister in Canadian history. You know, whether it came to balancing budgets, whether it came to electoral reform, it goes on and on and on. What I can tell you is this. In 2008, 2009, a conservative government was in place when the global recession hit. Yes, we had to invest heavily in our economy. We borrowed some money, but it was a conservative government that got us out of that recession and returned our country back to balance. It can be done. And the suggestion from my two colleagues that somehow we can blithely march into the future without turning our mind to when we will return our country to balance and begin living within our means again, I think is irresponsible. We as conservatives, we have a plan for small businesses. We have a plan for lower taxes, keeping the tax burden low. We have a plan for regulation and reducing regulation that strangles small businesses. And we have a plan to return to balanced budgets. You can trust us, folks. We've done it before and we will do it again.
Thank you, Ed. Sean, why should small business vote Liberal?
Look, this is a really important election. The decisions that we make as to how we come out of this pandemic recession are going to have impacts that last a generation. I think you'll understand that over the course of this pandemic, we've had the back of small businesses with programs like the wage subsidy, the rent subsidy, like small business loans, and a suite of other measures. We're going to do everything we can to defeat COVID-19 as quickly as possible. We're going to continue to be there for businesses and households to weather the storm through to the end of this pandemic. And importantly, the measures that we're putting forward are specifically targeting growth. They're going to bring workers back to the workforce. They're going to reduce the cost of investing in your business to grow. And they're going to reduce the cost of doing business by reducing fees, interchange fees, regulations you need to comply with. But the reality is we've come through the greatest economic emergency in my lifetime. We still have a AAA investment grade credit rating. We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. And it's because we've been making investments from the very beginning of this pandemic that are designed to preserve the economic infrastructure that our communities depend upon. You can rest assured that as we come out of this pandemic, we're going to continue to implement policies that are going to help your business grow, help Canadians come back to work, and set the stage for one of the strongest recoveries globally.
Thank you, Sean. Back over to you, Laura, to wrap things up.
Thanks, Corinne. And I see Dan has joined us again too. So I don't know if that's, maybe you've got a comment. So Dan, I'm going to, okay, great. I'll just wrap us up because we've skated a little over time. So I apologize for that. But just big thank you to all of the candidates for taking the time out of their very busy schedules for joining us. Big thank you to QuickBooks Intuit for suggesting this great idea and for making it possible for us to do this for you. And most importantly, big thank you to our small business members and our small business audience here today who do so much for the country. Thank you, and thank you for joining today. Couple of other just really quick things. First, we've got more information on our website, so CFIB.CA, and you'll find some great resources there on the /federal election, and you'll find recording of this event. You'll also find links to all of the party platforms, and you will find the survey that CFIB sent to all of the parties with small business specific questions. And we have all 6 parties there, including the People's Party of Canada, the Green Party, and the Bloc. So if you're interested in more information, that's a great resource for you. And finally, let's get out there and vote. We're very lucky to live in a country where we're able to do that, and where we have some influence on government and who's in power. So let's get out there and vote. And with that, we will say goodbye and thank you again, and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Ed. Good to see you guys.
Luck,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.